What would you do if you were pulled over for no reason, your heart racing as officers questioned you like you were a criminal, just because of the color of your skin? That's exactly what happened to Aaliyah. She was calm, polite, and respectful. But none of that mattered to the cops who treated her like she didn't belong. They thought they had all the power until her husband showed up. And the moment they saw his badge, their faces said it all. Before we continue, have you ever been judged unfairly? How did you handle it? Aaliyah was the kind of woman who carried herself with quiet confidence. She was smart, kind, and always kept her cool, no matter the situation. On this particular afternoon, she was just running errands, driving through a peaceful suburban neighborhood she had passed through many times before. The sun was out, the roads were clear, and there was nothing unusual about the day until flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. She pulled over calmly, wondering why she was being stopped. She knew she had not done anything wrong. No speeding, no broken lights, nothing out of place. But as soon as the officers approached, their demeanor was tense. They didn't offer the usual polite greeting. Instead, their tone was sharp, filled with suspicion for no clear reason. Aaliyah remained polite, answering their questions clearly, but it was obvious. They weren't interested in her words. Their eyes told the story. They weren't looking for a reason. They were looking for a problem. What they didn't know was that Aaliyah's husband, Marcus, was a police officer himself, one who believed in justice and fairness. And when Aaliyah realized this wasn't just a routine stop, she made one simple call that would change everything. As Aaliyah sat in her car, her hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, the officers approached with an air of authority that felt more intimidating than necessary. Their faces were stern, their voices sharp, and their questions came fast, as if they were trying to catch her in a lie she had not told. "License and registration," one officer barked, his eyes scanning her car like he was looking for something that was not there. Aaliyah handed over her documents without hesitation, her voice steady. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" The officer ignored her question, flipping through her paperwork as if the answer was hidden somewhere in the pages. The other officer stood on the passenger side, peering into the car suspiciously. "You seem nervous," the officer sneered. Aaliyah took a deep breath. "I am not nervous. I just want to understand why I was stopped." That simple question seemed to annoy them. The officer leaned in closer, his tone growing more condescending. "We will ask the questions here." At that moment, Aaliyah realized this was not about a traffic violation. This was something else, something rooted in bias and assumptions. She had done nothing wrong, yet she was being treated like a suspect. She remained calm, refusing to give them the reaction they seemed to expect. But inside, her heart was racing. Not from fear, but from frustration. She knew her rights. She knew this was wrong. The officer continued his aggressive questioning. "Where are you headed? What's in the car? Have you been drinking?" Aaliyah answered each question clearly and respectfully, but the officers were not listening. They were looking for a reason to escalate the situation. Then came the request that made her heart sink. "Step out of the vehicle." Aaliyah's mind raced. She knew that stepping out of the car could make her more vulnerable, but refusing could escalate things further. She nodded, unbuckled her seatbelt, and stepped out slowly, keeping her hands visible. As she stood there, one officer began searching her car without consent while the other kept questioning her about things that made no sense. Her heart pounded, not from guilt, because there was none, but from the weight of injustice pressing down on her. She quietly reached for her phone and called Marcus. "Hey," she said, her voice low but controlled. I have been pulled over. No reason given. They're searching the car. Can you come here?" Marcus's voice on the other end was steady, but filled with urgency. "I'm on my way." The officers continued, their tone growing even more aggressive. They asked if she had drugs in the car, if she had been drinking, if she was hiding anything. The absurdity of their accusations was infuriating, but Aaliyah kept her composure. One officer smirked. "You know, people get nervous when they have something to hide." Aaliyah looked him in the eye. "I have nothing to hide. But I do know my rights." Minutes later, Marcus arrived. He stepped out of his car, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the afternoon sun. The moment the officers saw him, their demeanor shifted. The arrogance faded, replaced by an awkward stiffness. Marcus walked over, his expression calm but firm. "Is there a problem here?" The officers stumbled over their words, suddenly unsure of themselves. "We were just conducting a routine stop," one of them muttered. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Routine stop? For what reason?" The officers exchanged nervous glances, struggling to come up with an answer. "She seemed suspicious." "Suspicious?" Marcus repeated, his tone sharp. "Because she was driving her car, minding her business." The silence was deafening. Marcus stepped closer, his authority undeniable. "Do you know who you just pulled over?" The officers looked down, realizing their mistake too late. "She's my wife," Marcus said, "and you're going to explain exactly why she was treated this way." They fumbled with excuses, talking about traffic patterns and safety checks, but their words were empty. The truth was clear. They had profiled her based on nothing but bias. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His presence alone was enough to make them uncomfortable. "This isn't about her being my wife," he said. "It's about how you treat people when you think no one is watching." The officers stood in silence, exposed and ashamed. Marcus continued, his voice steady but powerful. "Your badge is not a license to harass. It's a responsibility to serve and protect, without bias." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Marcus turned to Aaliyah, his eyes filled with pride. "Let's go." As they drove away, Aaliyah felt a mix of emotions, relief, frustration, and a quiet sense of victory. Not because her husband had saved her, but because she had stood her ground with grace and dignity. Later that evening, as they sat in their living room, Aaliyah broke the silence. "It's not just about today, Marcus. It's about how often this happens to people who don't have someone like you to show up." Marcus nodded. "That's why we have to keep speaking up. This isn't over." She looked out the window, her reflection staring back at her. "I was calm today because I had to be, but it shouldn't have to be that way. We deserve to live without that fear." Marcus reached for her hand. "We will change it, one story at a time, starting with ours." In the weeks that followed, Aaliyah shared her experience publicly, not out of anger, but out of hope that her story could shed light on the reality many face. Her words resonated with people far beyond her community, sparking conversations about bias, respect, and accountability. This was more than a traffic stop. It was a reflection of a deeper issue, one that needed to be seen and addressed. And thanks to Aaliyah's courage and Marcus's unwavering support, it was. Marcus stared at the two officers, his jaw clenched, his badge gleaming under the fading light. The air was thick with tension. The same officers who had treated Aaliyah like she was invisible now stood awkwardly, realizing they had made a mistake, one they could not talk their way out of. Marcus took a step closer, his eyes locked on them. "You pulled over my wife, for what reason?" The officers shuffled uncomfortably. One of them cleared his throat. "Routine stop. Just making sure everything was in order." Marcus's expression did not change. "Routine stop? You searched her car without consent. You questioned her like she was a suspect. What part of that sounds routine to you?" Neither of them had an answer. They avoided his gaze, fumbling with words that sounded more like excuses than explanations. Aaliyah stood beside Marcus, her face calm, but her heart racing. She had felt small under their scrutiny, but now, with Marcus standing firm, she realized something. They had never held real power. Their authority was built on intimidation. But the moment they were held accountable, it crumbled. Marcus took another step forward, his voice low but filled with authority. "Do you know what I see when I look at you? Officers who forgot what that badge stands for." The taller officer tried to regain control. "Look, we were just doing our job." "No," Marcus cut him off sharply. "You were abusing it." The words hit harder than if he had shouted. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Marcus pulled out his ID, showing them not just his badge, but his rank, a position higher than either of them. Their faces paled. They had not just harassed an innocent woman. They had done it to the wife of someone who knew the law better than they did. "So, now that you know who I am," Marcus continued, "does it change how you feel about what you did?" Neither officer responded. "That's the problem," Marcus said. "It shouldn't matter who she is or who I am. You should have treated her with respect from the start." Aaliyah finally spoke, her voice steady. "You didn't pull me over because I broke a law. You pulled me over because you made an assumption. And that assumption could have cost me more than just my time." Her words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Marcus turned back to the officers. "This isn't over. I will be filing a report. Not because I am angry, which I am, but because this cannot keep happening." The officers stood frozen, realizing the gravity of their actions. As Marcus and Aaliyah walked back to their car, Aaliyah felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, anger, pride, not because Marcus had spoken up, but because she had, too. She had faced them with dignity, even when they tried to strip it away. Driving home, Marcus reached for her hand. "I'm proud of you." Aaliyah glanced at him, her eyes filled with quiet strength. "I'm proud of us." They both knew this was not just about them. It was about every person who had been pulled over, questioned, or judged because of the way they looked. This confrontation was not just a personal victory. It was a small step in a much larger fight. The days following the confrontation were anything but quiet. Marcus filed an official complaint, not out of anger, but out of a deep sense of responsibility. He knew that what happened to Aaliyah was not an isolated incident. It was part of a bigger problem, a pattern that needed to be broken. But the real twist came when the investigation into the officers' behavior began. It turned out that those two officers had a history. Multiple complaints had been filed against them over the years, complaints that had been quietly swept under the rug. Reports of unnecessary stops, aggressive questioning, and racial profiling had been buried under paperwork and dismissed without proper review. Marcus was shocked, but not surprised. He had seen how the system sometimes protected the wrong people, hiding behind procedures and technicalities. But this time was different. This time, there was undeniable proof. Witnesses, reports, and Marcus's own account as both a police officer and a victim's family member. The department had no choice but to take the matter seriously. Aaliyah was called in to give her statement. She sat in the same office where countless complaints had been ignored before. But this time, she was not just another voice in the crowd. She was the voice that could not be silenced. She spoke clearly, her words sharp and filled with truth. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been stopped for no reason, treated like they don't belong, and left to feel powerless. You can't fix what you refuse to face. The officers were eventually suspended pending investigation. It was not the final justice, but it was a start. But the biggest revelation came from within Marcus himself. He had always believed in the system, in the idea that justice would prevail if you followed the rules. But this experience shattered that illusion. He realized that the system was only as strong as the people who upheld it, and too many people were more concerned with protecting their own than protecting what was right. That realization changed him. Marcus decided to take action beyond just filing reports. He started speaking out publicly, using his position to advocate for change within the department. He organized training sessions focused on bias, accountability, and community engagement. He refused to let his badge be a symbol of silence. Aaliyah stood by his side, sharing her story not just as a victim, but as a woman who refused to be defined by one bad experience. Together, they became a force for change, one voice challenging a system that had long needed reform. And the ripple effect was undeniable. People in their community started to speak up. Stories that had been hidden out of fear or shame were finally being heard. The officers who thought they could intimidate Aaliyah without consequence found themselves at the center of a movement they never saw coming. The twist wasn't just that Marcus was a high-ranking officer. The real twist was that Aaliyah's strength, combined with Marcus's position, became the spark that lit a fire no one could put out. Weeks passed since the investigation began, but the echoes of that day never really left Aaliyah and Marcus. The memory of flashing lights, the tension in the officers' voices, and the way Aaliyah's dignity was questioned without cause, those moments carved themselves into their hearts. But something else grew in that space too: strength. The department took action. The officers involved were not just suspended. They faced disciplinary hearings, and the cases they had been involved in were reopened for review. It was not just about one traffic stop anymore. It became a symbol of what happens when people refuse to stay silent. But for Aaliyah, the real victory was not in the disciplinary actions. It was in reclaiming her narrative. She started speaking publicly, not just about what happened to her, but about the countless others who never got the chance to tell their stories. Her voice, calm yet powerful, resonated beyond city lines, inspiring people to stand up, speak out, and demand respect, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had been treated unfairly. Marcus, too, found himself transformed. The badge he wore had always been a symbol of service, but now it carried new meaning. It was no longer just about enforcing the law. It was about protecting the very principles the law was supposed to stand for: fairness, justice, and accountability. Together, they hosted community meetings, sat on panels, and worked with organizations that aimed to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the people they served. They were not just reacting to an incident. They were creating change. But beyond the headlines, beyond the speeches, it was in the quiet moments where the real healing happened. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue across their living room, Marcus looked at Aaliyah. "Do you ever wish that day never happened?" Aaliyah thought for a moment. "Part of me does. No one deserves to feel powerless. But if it hadn't happened, we wouldn't be here, fighting for something bigger than ourselves." She was right. That day did not break them. It built them. Aaliyah's strength was never about what she endured. It was about how she responded, with grace, courage, and an unwavering belief that her voice mattered. Marcus's power was not just in his badge, but in the integrity he chose to stand for, even when it meant confronting his own. The lesson? Injustice might be loud, but resilience speaks louder. Their story is a reminder that standing up for what is right is not just about the big moments. It is about the small decisions we make every day, to speak up, to support, to refuse to let silence be mistaken for acceptance. So, the next time you find yourself in a situation where you feel powerless, remember Aaliyah and Marcus. Remember that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else matters more. And sometimes, the simple act of standing your ground is the most powerful thing you can do. Aaliyah and Marcus's story is more than just a lesson about injustice. It is a reminder of the power of standing up, even when your voice feels small. They turned a painful experience into a movement for change, proving that courage is not the absence of fear, but the strength to speak up when it matters most. Their journey showed that real change starts with ordinary people refusing to accept the unacceptable. Aaliyah's grace and Marcus's integrity did not just hold two officers accountable. They inspired an entire community to reflect, to question, and to demand better. Now let me ask you, have you ever faced a moment where you had to stand your ground, even when it felt difficult? How did that moment shape you? Or perhaps you've witnessed someone else's courage spark change. What did it teach you about the power of one voice? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story could inspire someone who needs to hear it today. And if Aaliyah and Marcus's journey moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us all of the strength within us. Thank you for watching. Remember, your voice matters, your story matters, and sometimes one brave moment can change everything.